Thank you. Welcome to all of you to this session entitled Blue Food for a Sustainable Future. Zero hunger by 2030 is the second UN Sustainable Development Goal. We were not exactly on track to meeting the goal even before the pandemic struck, and now, of course, we have the war in Ukraine, which affects us globally. The realization that there is an urgent need for a transformation of our food system is very clear. Something that last year's UN Food System Summit put squarely on everyone's agenda. But until recently, all the emphasis was on terrestrial food and agriculture. We now know that blue food of aquatic provenance, both fresh and marine, has a key role in the food system transformation and a sustainable future. Blue foods indeed represent a promising solution to the challenge of sustainability, of sustainably feeding a growing world population, while also making a positive contribution to food security, nutrition, economic growth, and jobs. We will be discussing all aspects of the role that blue foods play in sustainable future, with an emphasis on what policies and partnerships are needed to realize the potential for producing aquatic food sustainably. And I am delighted to be discussing this topic with a fantastic panel. Let me introduce them to you. Starting on my left is Jim Leap, who is William and Eva Price Senior Fellow at Woods Institute and co-director of the Center for Ocean Solutions. He has over 30 years' experience in nature conservation. In the past, Jim spent many years with the WWF International, including as the Director General. He's also Senior Fellow at Stanford University. Next to him, we have Elizabeth Cousins, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of United Nations Foundation. She has been at the forefront of global policy making innovation for over 20 years. She's a diplomat and thought leader who has worked on the front lines of peace processes, played an influential role in the UN policy innovations for peace building for the Sustainable Development Goals, and has helped build public-private partnership to solve global challenges at scale. And last but definitely not least, we have Jane Nelson, who is Director of Corporate Responsibility Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and a non-resident Senior Fellow at Brookings Institution. In the past, she was a director and then senior advisor at the Prince of Wales International Business Leaders Forum, a senior associate with the Institute for Sustainability Leadership at Cambridge University, and an advisor and track leader at the Clinton Global Initiative. Before we start our discussion, and I should also say that this session is open for all of you sharing what we discuss here on social media. So if you're tweeting, and we encourage tweeting, please use the hashtag WEF22. But before we open our discussion, we have a great privilege of being joined by Gustavo Manrique Miranda, who is Minister of the Environment, Water and Ecological Transition of Ecuador. And Minister will give us some opening remarks to set our conversation here. And I should say that Mr. Miranda has more than 20 years of experience working for sustainability. During his time as Minister, he has executed the declaration of a new marine reserve in the Galapagos Islands, has significantly extended Ecuador's national system of protected areas and promoted the ecological transition of the country across various government sectors. Minister, please join us here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for those kind words. I was thinking these days when I was preparing the words, what to share with you, and I thought that I don't have the credential to speak globally, but I do have the credentials to speak locally from my country, that what we have done in the last months or years. And I want to start by, yes, affirming or confirming that in the last 12 months, we have increased by 40% our marine protected areas, because we believe that less is more in life as a you know, how do you say, we have confirmed that less area by oversplit, you get more fishing and more things. It is important for you to know that Ecuador has the biggest fishing fleet in the Pacific East, and we have the highest rate of child chronic malnutrition. So what does those two things have to do or have in common is that I want to be sure that you are aware of that effort. I mean, we need all the money we can in order to fight child chronic malnutrition. So reducing our fishing effort, it is a message of maturity, of understanding that the developing and conservation are parallel strategies, not separate. So I'm going to share some thoughts and experience about Ecuador specifically. It is important for you to know that we reached this year a $5 billion exportation in shrimp. That's our number one income. We export 800,000 tons a year. We, with China and a couple more countries, we are the biggest shrimp producer. But that created us a threat for mangrove. So in the past years, now I think we have it very much controlled, but in the past year there was a lot of illegal deforestation for the mangrove. So the way we find out how to control the illegal deforestation was to work from bottom to top with the communities, and we create small communities, association, and we gave the concessions for them in order to take care of the mangrove. Just as the owner of a big shrimp farm, they own, as a concession, the land of a mangrove where we harvest the crab and the shell or conch, cangrejo y concha, which is a very typical food in Ecuador. So a way that we find how to keep going, being one of the most biggest producer and exporter of shrimp, is that we gave the land to the communities, because if not, we as a small country and poor country, controlling by satellites, fast boats, coast guards, it is impossible. We have other unfulfilled basic needs in order to focus money there. So now it isn't, I feel an honor for you to share that we have 200,000 protected areas by the local community. Of course, we create some banning and some, how do you call when you don't fish for a while, or you don't, moratorium. Some moratorium, thank you. So protecting, it's now part of our ADN. In the last month, we created a new marine reserve, 6 million, with Your Highness as a judge there in Glasgow, a new marine reserve, 6 million hectares. And protecting our biodiversity, the coral and the reefs, we want to become the first country in the region in order to protect the corals, because what is happening, we are a very rich country in terms of marine cost biodiversity. So the tourism goes a lot there, and they throw their anchors. And the current start moving the boat, and we noticed that we were killing the coral reefs in the last years because of being rich. So now we're looking for resources in order to put buoys all over just the boats. So it's a simple action, and you know that 25% of the sea protein comes from the coral reefs. So we're working to put the boys all around there. Another important thing that worldwide we need to discuss is the homologation of practice at the sea. I told you that we are the biggest fishery fleet in the ETP, but we don't have the same practices than the WTP. We have moratorium, they don't. We can increase our fishing fleet, they can't. They can refuel at the sea, we can't. So there are a lot sizing and a lot of things that sometimes we feel like we have a nurturing of the fish because we find out that the species are migratory. Boundaries are created by human, not for species. Yeah. So we create this nucleus at Galapagos, and we are protecting these submarine mountains that connect to Costa Rica, and then Costa Rica connects to Panama, and Costa Rica connects to Colombia. We have the biggest transboundary cross-frontier worldwide, but our practices are much strict than the WTP, yes. So, as a last point, I want to share a very innovative thing that we're doing with FAO. How do you translate FAO? Galapagos has a geographic barrier, to get products there is a lot of effort to bring it from the continent. But Galapagos, it has been, laid down on the tourism because it is a very big income for the islands. So we just signed with FAO to become the first territory to have the carbon footprint in the menus to be aware the consumer of a red light of a fish, let's say a blue economy, or if that fish comes from Chile as a salmon. I know we're talking about this issue, but we have local fish that you should eat. Believe it or not, in Galapagos, you can eat a salmon. So that will help the consumer to understand in the islands specifically that if you consume pez brujo, for example, that money will go to the local fishing artisanal than to the big industry in Chile, even though both are promoting the seafood. So we're working that. We hope to have that traffic light. We hope to have the salmon with a red light and pez brujo with a green light. And, the consumer will choose that one. And the same with a beverage from a continent beverage or a local juice or a local endemic beer versus an international beer. So we are creating that local law in order to promote local consumer, that it will load down the carbon footprint, but more important, will leave the money in the local economy. Yeah, so those are 3 or 4 experiences that I wanted to share with you. We're taking it really seriously, all that public policy. And thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister. Really great, a series of really great comments, which I think we will be returning to in our conversation. And can I just say, what you opened with, you said that you had no credentials to speak on a global level, but on a local level. How many lessons for us across the globe come from what the examples that you gave from a local national level? And I think we'll come back to this, that interchangeability of scales, that things done locally are important on a global scale, and of course the impact vice versa. But there were many other things you touched on, which I think the panel resonated with the panel very well, and we will come back to it. I'd like to start by zooming out a little bit. and I'm going to turn to Jim first, if I may. So, the session title very boldly states that blue foods are important for a sustainable future. So why do we have that confidence that blue foods, we have to consider and integrate into our thinking blue foods when we think about a sustainable future?
Well, thanks, Magdalena, and thank you, Minister. I can't imagine a better way to start this session. And even, well, for all the reasons Magdalena said, we're having a global conversation, but you have given us a set of shining examples of why this is so important and what can be done. I mean, all of us know that food lies at the very heart of the challenge of sustainability. Right? It is the principal driver of biodiversity loss around the world, a big contributor to climate change. The list goes on. Blue foods are already an important part of the food system, a major source of protein and nutrition for 3 billion people, but they are generally ignored in discussions about the future of food. And that's something that has to change, not just because they're important today, but because they are potentially such an important part of meeting the challenges that we face. And that's for several reasons. And I'm going to speak from something which I need to make sure to remember, which is the Blue Food Assessment. The Blue Food Assessment was begun under the auspices of the Friends of Ocean Action, which is a World Economic Forum initiative. It's a partnership between Stanford, the Stockholm Resilience Center, and EAT, and importantly, Springer Nature. All the work produced through this Blue Food Assessment, more than 100 scientists around the world, is being published in the Nature journals. And this was the first concerted look at the role of blue foods in food systems. And what it tells us is a couple things, well, many things. So I encourage you to look at bluefood.earth, because I don't have time to cover all that I'd like to cover. But a couple things. One is blue foods are incredibly diverse. Right? There are 4 species that account for more than 90% of the meat produced on land. 2 species of cows, chickens, pigs. There are 2,500 species of blue foods. Right? And that diversity holds enormous opportunity. That's the first thing. Second, these foods can be incredibly nutritious. If you look at all the blue foods, most of the blue food categories are more nutritious across all the major micronutrients, are richer in micronutrients than any of the terrestrial meats. Right? And some of them are superfoods, I mean, really dense in vital micronutrients. There's a tiny fish grown in carp ponds in Bangladesh called a mola. It accounts for 98% of the vitamin A in the Bangladesh diet. Right? So for vitamin A, B12, calcium, zinc, for many micronutrients, blue foods really actually essential. The second is that blue foods can be much greener, much lighter in footprint. Not automatic, so let's not ignore overfishing, which is a big challenge in many fisheries. Let's not ignore illegal fishing and some destructive forms of aquaculture. So there are challenges that have to be cracked. But there are many blue foods that are intrinsically lighter in footprint than food produced on land. So they offer a big opportunity. So as we looked at all this, we came away with, of course, policy recommendations, which I will not recite in full. But the most fundamental one is that we need to manage blue foods as part of the food system. They tend to be the province of fisheries ministers who are often on the margins of power in government. Right? And a core challenge is to bring blue foods onto the main table, where health ministers, finance ministers, development ministers chart the future of a country's economy to help them see the vital importance of blue foods for their many interests. And as they do that, recognize that most of it is produced by small fishers. Most of the food we eat is produced by small-scale actors, so we need to pay attention to what they need and how they thrive. Right? And we need to capitalize on that diversity because there are blue foods which are better for us and which are better for the environment, and developing those systems will go a long way to helping us crack the challenge of a sustainable food system. I'll stop there.
So if I can just follow up, thank you. That was
wow, I get a follow-up.
Terrific, of course. Do you feel that this transition towards integration of blue foods, are we actually succeeding? I mean, my own sense in the run-up to the UN Food Systems Summit, initial conversations were rather siloed and separate. Yep. By the time we came to the summit, it was a more connected conversation. Are you optimistic about what's happened already?
Yeah, so I'm chronically, not chronologically, optimistic.
Chronologically.
Maybe chronologically too. So I want to start with actually 2 things here. And one is blue food turned out to be a label that actually helped us get people to look twice, right? And Christian Teleke here gets credit for that. And secondly, the UN Food System Summit, we, the Blue Food Assessment, actively engaged the summit process. But Peter Thompson, the special envoy for the ocean, joined with Agnes Kalibata, the special envoy for the Food System Summit, to together say to everybody in the summit community, we need to be paying attention to food from the water as well as food from the land. And I think we opened the door. Do we have success yet? No, but we have opened the door, and I think we have a new recognition of the relevance of blue food across ministries.
That's important to acknowledge, and also to acknowledge that there is work to be done. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So, you know, when I opened this session with my introductory remarks, I of course said that, you know, the goal was to have zero hunger by 2030, and even before the pandemic and before the current war, we were not likely to meet that target. Clearly, we're much further off the target now. Elizabeth, can I ask you, what's your sense, what's our best chance for transforming the food system, securing achieving food security in these times of crises, which of course are ongoing or in some kind of cyclical fashion keep coming back?
Well, thank you, Magdalena, and great to be here and with you all. Let me start by saying a few things about the scale of the challenge. So we were already at the end of 2021 at estimated 141 million people who were food insecure in the world. As a result of everything from cumulative climate pressures that we all know too much about, to the war on Ukraine and all of the cascading effects from that, there's now an estimated 276 million people who are food secure globally, of which almost 50 million are at emergency proportions, meaning on the brink of famine. Not yet at famine, but on the brink. So it's a very dire situation that threatens to get worse by the day. Now, there are a couple of ways that in the immediate blue foods hold a part of the answer to that challenge. So first, in the immediate short term, there are any number of countries, particularly import-dependent countries, who have aquatic resources for food, whether it's freshwater or marine. And so I think we're likely to see any number of populations who are returning to those sources and relying on them in this immediate context of rising food prices, rising energy prices, rising fuel prices. That's one. But two, longer term, there is no universe in which, I mean, as Jim has just said, blue foods are not indivisible with our food systems agenda and with our climate agenda. It is one agenda. That's, of course, the core logic of the SDGs to begin with. It's something I have heard Peter Thompson speak about passionately from the time of taking on this role as special envoy. It is one agenda. So you, Jim, already spoke to some of the scale. 3 billion people in the world for whom blue foods are 20% of their protein, the nutritional value of blue foods, the lower environmental footprint of blue foods, obviously subject to the caveats that you mentioned already about doing that in sustainable ways. So to me, this is both a short-term question where we have some emergency response that's required to save millions of people from really truly dire circumstances, but then longer term fully to embrace the possibility of putting blue foods at the center of our food and climate agendas.
Exactly. It's such a challenge in many ways. You know, here a second ago we were talking about siloing away the terrestrial food from the aquatic food, but you just obviously brought in the fact that we have hand-in-hand issue of climate change, food insecurity, and then of course biodiversity issues. Jim, you said how incredibly diverse blue foods were. I'm sort of not going to pose it as a question to this panel, but just to signal that I hope your optimism for how the aquatic and terrestrial food is coming together can also be extended to how these conversations around biodiversity, climate, and then food security are beginning to converge more and more. One of the things that the Minister touched on actually was these wonderful examples of how you empower local people to then effectively create almost a self-policing system which works both for the people and then protects the environment. And there was a little bit of tension in the comment between the big sort of fishing fleet and the local fishers. So, Jane, can I turn to you now to ask you what should we think and what should we look for in the role that the private sector plays first, and then I'll come on to asking you about that tension between the private and public.
Great. No, well, thank you, Magdalena, and wonderful to be here. And I think there's absolutely no doubt that the private sector's role is critical. Having said that, government must lead, and thank you, Minister, for demonstrating that combination of national leadership and integrated leadership across ministries at the national level, and then that sort of transboundary cooperation and trying to get common standards and common approaches cross-boundary. But we're simply not going to get there without the private sector. And I think, thinking in the area of blue foods, it's useful to break into sort of three broad categories of private sector. They're the large national or multinational companies that are crucial to the blue food value chain, either harvesting, processing, marketing, financing, etc. But secondly, there are the millions of artisans, small fishers, small-scale enterprises whose entire livelihoods depend on the blue food value chain and need to be at the table. And then thirdly, there are also almost every company, but certainly large companies, both nationally and globally, that have a major impact on bodies of water, and both negative and positive, and in mining, other types of agriculture, energy, manufacturing. And I think we need to think more broadly that those companies as well need to be brought into this discussion on how important blue foods are and why they have a role in making sure that they're inclusive, sustainable and nutritious. And having said that, though, despite those sort of three different categories, I think there's also three key things that certainly the big companies, but also some of the smaller companies need to focus on. And I think it's relevant across different sectors. And I'd break it under protect and respect, innovate and advocate. And first of all, protect and respect. I mean, most importantly, we need to set those standards, and there are lots of voluntary standards at the moment, more and more regulatory standards on what is expected of companies in blue food value chains, but as well as other companies in the impact that they're having on the water, on the biodiversity that is so crucial to growing the blue foods ecosystem. But also, what is the impact that they have on those millions of artisans and fishers and small enterprises in the value chain? At a minimum, are they respecting their rights? And we know that many of the fishers and global food value chains work in appalling working conditions. So there's both the sort of environmental responsibilities as well as the people responsibilities for the big companies that operate in the blue food value chain. But then secondly, there is the opportunity to innovate. And so I think that sort of first do no harm has to be foundational, and it gives you the license to then innovate. But the innovation opportunities are immense. What we have now with biosciences, digital science technologies, material sciences, to innovate from your production of a whole range of blue foods, harvesting, processing is enormous. And so really investing in all those sort of science and digital technologies, I think, is one opportunity. There are business model innovation opportunities to do things differently, to be more inclusive of the smaller producers in the value chain. And then there's also marketing communications opportunities, and using the incredible creative power and advertising budgets of companies to get the messages out around blue foods that Jim was mentioning, and why they are so important for our future. And then thirdly is advocate. And I think companies should be doing more. Companies are pretty good at policy lobbying. They should be doing more in sort of progressive lobbying around that blue food, terrestrial food, climate, water agenda, and I think can play an important role in calling on governments to set more on science-based frameworks and standards and requirements. And I think the leading companies are now ready to do that, because they realise that they have some advantage being out ahead of their peers and competitors, but unless they can bring the peers and competitors with them, they're not going to get the scale, and sometimes the peers and competitors will underprice them and undermine them. So I think there's a growing recognition and growing advocacy for strong policy dialogue between the leaders and the public sector for setting science-based sort of standards and expectations of business. So I think we're seeing progress in all of those areas of protect and respect, innovate and advocate, but it's a sort of vanguard of companies that are out ahead, both in the blue foods ecosystem as well as other systems. And now it's how do we scale that and expand that, so that for every company, coming to your point about the integration between climate, water, food, I think the leading companies are looking at these challenges in a more integrated way. And so the bigger challenge is probably looking at an integrated way from a public policy perspective. But again, companies can be advocates to say, we actually have to look at this in a more integrated way, and this is how we're doing it.
No, that's terrific. Thank you. And as you were laying out this, what the companies need to engage in, I was going to ask you, is it happening? Are they actually doing it? You just said that there's a swell beginning to companies beginning to engage with that. And of course, what we're now discussing, so I feel sometimes there is a temptation to talk about blue food only from the food systems perspective and reducing hunger. But of course, there's a very important justice aspect to this, and each of you has touched on this, and Minister also, that the fact that so many people's livelihoods is so closely tied to the so small scale fishing. Absolutely. This was actually one of the recommendations that came out of the Blue Food Assessment, right?
Yes, justice.
Justice,
yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Can I speak to that?
Please.
Okay, so when we think about injustice in the blue food system, we often go straight to forced labor, and there is a terrible forced labor, slavery problem in the blue food sector. But that's the tip of a much larger iceberg, right? There are lots of challenges of justice in blue food, as there are in other food systems and other parts of the economy. To take two examples, I mean, one is that there are thousands and thousands of communities around the world who depend for their livelihoods and for their own food on small-scale coastal fisheries. Those are often squeezed out, displaced by industrial development of one kind or another. Fishing rights sold off to distant water fleets, or large-scale aquaculture, or simply coastal developments. So putting small-scale fishers on the map, as it were, as an interest that needs to be safeguarded in policy is one justice issue. A second is that in this domain, as in others, the governance and management and attention tend to be dominated by men. And in fact, half the workers in the blue food sector are women, and often women as fishers are centrally important to the food security of their households. And then they are also dominant in particular parts of the sector, in particular processing. So making sure that the role of women is recognized, that the women are therefore in governance and management and so forth equally with men is a second justice issue. Just quickly, one of the things that comes out of our justice research, which will be published in the next couple of months, is that where governments have head-on addressed these challenges, have adopted policies expressly recognizing and addressing justice issues, those policies really do make a difference. So it is an area where public policy can at least help drive change, but it needs to.
Yeah. So thank you for this. And Elizabeth, I wanted to bring you in. Did you have a comment directly?
I was going to say, as your research is coming out, I hope from the private sector side you will be also promoting the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and the rights-based aspects that companies should be looking at.
Yeah, well, the research is research.
Okay.
But we will be promoting those kinds of solutions on the basis of the research. You know.
Very good point. So, Elizabeth, I wanted to extend this concept of justice that we're now discussing to actually take us back into this relationship between blue food and climate and diversity. Of course, there is such a thing as climate justice, and all of these other changes and vulnerabilities play into sort of our need to focus on justice for these small fishing communities. Can you comment on, do you feel that interventions from one sort of focus, let's say climate, can be then ported to the interventions in the space of blue food? How interchangeable do you see that?
Well, I put it a slightly different way. I mean, first, I 1,000% agree with the emphasis on justice, and one of the ways to give practical expression to that is to do much better than we all do in our respective domains, to have different people at the table, not only at the table of agendas that have already been set, but shaping the agendas to begin with. And I actually think this is where your point about the local is so incredibly powerful. In many conversations over the course of this week and in other fora, we're hearing about a localization revolution. that is incredibly powerful, worth listening to, and really important to give very practical expression to. That can be politically challenging in a lot of environments, but I think it holds really important keys to the sort of scale of change that we need to make and the speed of change that we need to make. Your question about sort of importing across, I'd almost want to ask it a little bit differently, which is single interventions that have multiple impacts across different jurisdictional domains or different policy domains that we care about. So I think the real key is to think about what those interventions are, what those policy responses are, and to try to have those driven by, to my mind, what is most needed by a given community, a given ecosystem or geography. That's the most strategic way, I think, to really think about devising solutions that then have climate value. They have obviously impact for our food systems and across the board.
Exactly. Are there any questions from the audience, from the floor? Any comments? There's a question here at the front, if I can have the microphone.
Thanks very much. Elizabeth touched on the fact that fresh water is there in this whole debate, and I think I was going to ask the panel just to say a little bit more about the implications for freshwater fish, because when we talk about blue foods we tend to think about just the sea, but I think the panel can tell us that it's actually equally important. Fish from rivers and lakes and ponds, and that's where the majority of aquaculture comes from, of course. And when we're talking about the big idea of Friends of Ocean Action, for example, of bringing aquaculture from Asia, where 90% of it is, apart from the salmon, to the African continent, where only about 3% of it is, and where that nutrition would be so valuable. It's land-based fish, tilapia and catfish and things like that. So just a little bit of a comment on that, because I also understand, and Jim, you probably know more about this, that the biodiversity loss problem for freshwater fish is just huge, right? There's something that, along those lines, please.
Well, let me say a quick word, and others may also want to respond to this. So one decision made at the beginning, which is hard for me as the director of the Center for Ocean Solutions, was that blue food should be all ocean and freshwater for a variety of reasons, right? I mean, in the marketplace, these are fish and aquatic animals or plants. So we've looked at the whole thing, and as you say, and when it comes to aquaculture, freshwater really is by far the most important sector. And all the things we've been saying here about the opportunities for higher nutrition, lower environmental footprint translate into that context, but are not automatic. So there are serious challenges with biodiversity, for example, in some freshwater fisheries or impacts of some freshwater aquaculture. But for sure, one should be looking at that whole system. And at the moment, China China, and then more broadly Asia completely dominate the aquaculture picture. I mean, they are a huge share of total global production, but there's a lot of scope for expansion into Africa and other places, and that's a big part of a future blue food agenda, I think.
And I think it sort of relates to the comment I made about companies outside the sort of so-called blue food value chain, that the more one's looking at freshwater aquaculture. I'm doing some work with companies, some of the energy companies in Nigeria, and one of the aspects they're looking at is aquaculture. And so again, make sure first of all that you're doing no harm in terms of negative impacts on both the watersheds and biodiversity, but what are the opportunities for other national and international companies to support blue foods livelihoods and programs in the watersheds in which they're operating? And I think we're barely scratching the surface on that. And many of these sort of big footprint companies support traditional agriculture programs, but haven't been approached on this agenda. So I think it would certainly expand the corporate engagement.
Well, and there's a real opportunity this year with the COP coming up in Sharm el-Sheikh, I think, with a meaningful period of time to really build the coalitions that are already strong and growing momentum around a set of commitments, some real deliverables that can be tabled at that time this year.
Very good point. There's another question at the front here.
Thank you so much. I have one question about the private sector which are close to the consumption or consumers. That we talk mostly about the production side, but then do you have any suggestion, the expectation of the private sector companies closer to the consumers, and more information how we can really leverage the power of the consumption, the consumers to influence through the value chain on this important agenda of the food.
No, absolutely, and I only touched on it very briefly. I think there's, again, enormous untapped potential, both for food companies, and Mark and a few of us were at a lunch today talking about that very topic, how the consumer-facing food companies, but also advertising agencies, others, could really be ramping up what they're doing on raising awareness, educating about blue foods, the benefits of blue foods. I'm sure some of you are familiar. Unilever's Knorr product with WWF just did a Future 50 Foods publication, and you're part of that's blue food. So how could more of those things be ramped up? Enormous potential, both in increasing the range of products and foods that are offered by these companies, but also on the consumer awareness side and consumer engagement. And from a humanitarian perspective, your company's sort of philanthropic programs could be doing more in addressing some of the short-term crisis issues that Elizabeth mentioned.
Can I just add two quick things there, Nyoko? One is that the sustainable seafood movement over 25 years has really helped drive sustainability into this sector, and retail has been central to that. Yeah. Right? That's the pinch point in the value chain, and retailers have really led the drive in significant ways. But the second is, I was on a call through part of the Blue Food Partnership that the Forum has convened, which brings together the private sector and public around the future of blue food, with a wholesaler who sells both to retail and food service. And she said they stock 25 species for retailers and 125 for food service. Because all of us buying fish to cook at home buy familiar things, right? But chefs in food service can have a much broader range, and therefore potentially quite an interesting role in bringing greater diversity into our diets.
Yeah,
that's very interesting. And may I remind you something that the minister said that I personally really loved, actually, the carbon footprint on the menu.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I have to say, so I live in London, and very recently in restaurants in London, the calories have been added to the menu, which in itself is very informative and influences one's choice. But carbon footprint on the menu, I think that would really directly influence consumer behavior, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're coming to the end of our session, but I want to ask you one final question. And again, it's something that I was struck by what the minister said, and that is this diversity of policies and regulation, even within actually, at times, the same region. So in terms of enabling blue foods for sustainable future, how much work do we need to do in that policy and regulation space? And are you optimistic that the right conversations are starting? Are we going in the right direction? Are we exchanging knowledge from different regions? Whoever wants to start?
I'll start. Okay. Yes.
Okay.
So that's an important place to start. No, one of the things that came out of the Food System Summit was a coalition on blue foods, right? And we've got more than 20 member states, from the US and the European Union to Fiji and Ghana, who are saying we want to be part of advancing this agenda. And that is two things. That's continuing to elevate blue foods in the international dialogue. So continuing to bring blue foods into food system discussions. But secondly, how do we actually find ways to mobilize support for countries who are stepping up to take on this challenge, who are in concrete ways bringing blue foods into the heart of their food system policymaking? And I think there's just huge potential there. And I think that's a conversation we can confidently say has started and has opened up possibilities we didn't have a couple of years ago.
Perhaps a topic for another panel next year. Any final comments?
It started, we need to move rapidly through the door and really keep up the pressure, and that's where some of the consumer and more popular and advocacy demands will help create the right kind of positive pressure on a sustained basis.
Absolutely. Exactly. So thank you very much to my panel and to all of you. I think the Minister wishes to have the last word.
Yeah, just a short example.
It's coming, the other side.
Just a short example of a public policy that we are implementing regarding blue food related to mangrove. We evaluate the ecosystemic service of the mangrove, okay, depending in which zone and how big was the area. And we evaluate in $7 to $10 yearly. So we have a program named Partner Mangrove that the government pays these small communities in order to subsidize some things between $7 and $10. And they use that for controlling, increasing capacity and some other things. So that public policy that now it is paid 80% by fiscal money, government money, and 20%, between 20 and 30% for international cooperation. But it's and we're doing the same for highlands and other paths. But regarding this meeting, it is really working that public policy in order to create this mangrove partner that we subsidize between $7 and $10 per hectare per year to protect the blue food around the mangrove, which is the crab and the oyster.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing this with us and the other examples. Again, thank you, Minister. Thank you to the panel. It's very clear that blue foods have an absolutely central role to play in the sustainable future at many different levels, as we discussed here. And then so many different actors have to come together to actually make it happen. Governments, private sector, public sector, and also, of course, every single one of us as well. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Magdalena.
Thank you.